Welcome back to Speak. This podcast aims to address the needs of our communities by breaking down social barriers through education, activism, and advocacy. I'm Esty, and I'm joined by my co-host Mara. We hope that this discussion inspires you to continue these conversations both in this space and beyond.
Change is an act, a resource, and a guide to not only bettering our own lives, but those of our community as well. Today's topic is interconnection of climate change and girls' rights, where we will be examining how climate change is a threat to gender equality.
The global climate crisis presents a need for urgent responses from institutions in all sectors. When regarding both planetary health and women's rights, there is a tendency to believe that the two exist in entirely different realms. In reality, however, the two are inextricably linked, prompting the need for policies that address these issues simultaneously.
Joining us today, we have two special guests from Plan International Canada, Charlotte, a youth advocate, and Rodayna, a program lead and youth specialist and advocate. We're going to pass it over to them to introduce ourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Charlotte. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to the Speak podcast on having me today. It's such an honor. Again, my name is Charlotte. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling in today from the east coast of Canada, based in the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, or also known as Nova Scotia. I'm a youth advocate with Plan International Canada, and I've been actively involved with many of their initiatives, including Speakers Bureau, the Change the Birth Story campaign, and now serving my first year on Plan Canada's Youth Council. As an activist, but also a woman in STEM, I recognize that women and girls are disproportionately affected by unpredictable ecological changes, so I'm super passionate about gender equality, climate action, and how and why they intersect. I am so excited to be a part of this month's podcast episode and hope it inspires you to enact a bit of change in your community. And I'll pass it over to Rodayna.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. What a great start. So hi, everyone. So nice to be here today. I'm Rodayna. My pronouns are she, her. And as mentioned, I'm a youth specialist and an advocate with Plan International Canada, and also a program lead with expertise in women empowerment, gender equity, and youth and civic engagement. My vision is to help youth reach their full potential and also empower young women. And one of my favorite quotes is, "Change starts with you, but it doesn't start with you until you do." It's by Tom Ziegler.
All right. Thank you so much both for your introductions. It's so nice to meet you both. So yeah, let's get started. By engaging multidisciplinary perspectives, we can identify the interconnectedness of climate change and human rights issues. This requires a solid understanding of how environmental justice and social justice intersect. So my first question to you folks is, how do you define climate change to a general audience as well as to an academic audience?
So let me start with the academic definition and then move forward with the more general one to make it easier for folks. So an academic definition for climate change would be that climate change refers to the changes in Earth temperature, humidity, air pressure, wind, clouds, and precipitation patterns over time. And global warming, it is a contributing factor to climate change and refers specifically to the effect of the greenhouse gases on Earth average surface temperature. But to simplify it and guide it to a more general definition, so climate change refers to a long-term shift in temperatures and weather patterns. These are shifts that may be natural, but since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, and that is primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas. And climate change is something that is affecting all of us. Whether you realize it or not, you have probably experienced it or at least heard about it, or heard about the effects of climate change. So maybe you have watched rivers or lakes dry up, or maybe you have heard about floods, droughts, wildfires, or severe storms for the first time. Or maybe because of these climate change effects, you have seen or heard about people and communities forced to leave their homes, becoming climate refugees in search of new homes that are safer to them or places to be able to live in. So that is climate change in a nutshell. But I think it's very important to actually differentiate between the difference between climate and weather. I think a lot of folks think that climate and weather is the same thing, but it's actually not. So climate and weather are relatable, but not interchangeable. So being able to differentiate between both is something that is essential. So weather refers to short-term atmospheric conditions, while climate is weather of a specific region averaged over a long period of time.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. Thanks, Mara, for an amazing first question. It really opens up not only this podcast episode, but also future dialogues as well, because I think it's really important to make what is generally considered hard topics, so many social justice topics that are hard to talk about, easier to understand through more accessible language, which is why I really liked how you asked us to provide a definition that relates to the general audience, because this allows conversation to open up and make them more inclusive. So for me, I would honestly describe a climate change to a general and academic audience using the same definition. So climate change is described as fluctuations in the Earth's temperature. This creates weather patterns that typically enact detrimental effects on the environment and thus all life forms. Natural environmental cycles do play a cause in climate change. However, anthropogenic, which means human pollutants and human man-made activities, have rapidly increased the rate of the ecological breakdown and climate injustices. You may have seen many of the harmful effects in our own Canadian backyard, and we actually have discussed this in a course that I took this past semester called the Arctic Environment. I am happy to share the crux of my research in that class, which deals with Inuit food systems in the Arctic tundra. But let me backtrack a little bit. In the Arctic tundra, the Arctic Ocean acts as a sink for many persistent organic pollutants, which is also known as POPs, that transpire through the south. POPs can bioaccumulate and biomagnify, which is super scary if you think about it. Basically, bioaccumulation literally means to accumulate within an organism. The contaminate will then increase in magnification, hence biomagnification, as the food chain increases within Arctic animals, which include terrestrial, aerial, and marine populations. So literally all mammals. POPs, of course, have damaging effects on species populations, so wildlife populations, but it is also damaging to humans. Subsistence hunting, which includes the hunting of mammal species and wildlife populations, serves as a main source of nutrition for the Inuit peoples of the Arctic. But both population declines and decreased habitat diversity is happening all across the world, not just in the Western Hemisphere. Humans are animals too, and so more and more people are being displaced as refugees as a result of climate change.
Thank you, both of you, for those really intelligent answers. I think it really helps bring a bit more of a spotlight to what exactly climate change is. And like Charlotte was saying, it is really important to make these kind of big topics really accessible to people and use language that's understandable. But now that we have a bit more of a background, we want to draw those connections and how those relate to human rights. So our next question is, what is the link between girls' and women's rights and climate change? What does this intersection look like on a local scale versus that of a national or international scale?
Well, this is a great question. So if we're speaking more internationally, across societies, the impact of climate change affects women and men differently. So women are often responsible for gathering and producing food, collecting water, or sourcing fuel for heating and cooking. And with climate change, these tasks are becoming more and more difficult. So extreme weather events such as droughts and floods have greater impact on the poor and most vulnerable. And as you know, or as you may know, that 70% of the world's poor are actually women. So climate change also results in the unequal access to health, education, participation, and protection for girls. And climate shocks and stresses place girls, especially during the adolescence, at increased risk of human trafficking, sexual and gender-based violence, and unplanned pregnancies, and also allow for harmful practices such as an early and forced child marriage. And all of that is due to the growing of poverty of these communities due to relocating, natural disasters, and climate change in general. So this is if we're speaking a little bit on an international scale. And in a more local scale, it is mostly affecting Indigenous women. They have experienced the impact of climate change for generations, and they have been leaders in conserving the environment for even longer. And with their vast knowledge and experience, women still don't fully take part in deciding climate action. So empowering women to act on climate change should definitely be a priority for all around the world.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I agree also with your opinion on empowering women can lead to so much more change. So yeah, definitely. So I guess that leads us to our next question of why are women and girls more vulnerable to environmentally induced disparities? And which, I guess you touched on that already, but if Charlotte wants to add anything on it, which groups or demographics are most impacted?
Thanks, Mara, for that question. So like I mentioned, climate change affects all living things, but women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, and there are a multitude of reasons why. Just to list off a few effects are women and girls having a lack of education, a lack of accessibility for health services, and an increased length of gender inequality. Women and girls are often deemed as caretakers in households and not seen as breadwinners, meaning they have duties to not only gather, but produce food and create meals for their families every single day. This means that because women and girls are out fulfilling these caretaker responsibilities, they don't have opportunities or time to receive a proper education. There's an increased intersection between climate change and gender inequality. MNCH, which is an acronym for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health, and SRHR, which is another acronym that stands for Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights, are at the forefront. It's time to continue the talk of becoming more gender inclusive in the aftermath of climate imbalances. It's so important for all women and girls to have rights to their bodies and accessible health services for not only their physical and mental well-being, but also their sexual and reproductive health and rights. It's time for women and girls to be empowered and educated and have opportunities to make their own decisions. But climate change is impeding this right to women and girls and their reproductive rights. There is an increase in infant and mother mortality with the high rise of unplanned pregnancies, and lack of accessibility to sexual and reproductive health services don't help that at all. And there's this lack of accessibility because of social taboos, stigma, and overall poor health in the country. There was a study done by the United Nations that found 80% of the time, women and girls are often dislodged and displaced from their homes due to shifts in climatic conditions. During anthropogenic, so man and human-made activities, natural disasters like floods and earthquakes, and even pandemics, women and girls are often put in a position that makes them face challenge upon challenge. These include physical safety, security, access to health services and education, and even, honestly, a safe place to stay, let alone call home. Gender-based violence and exploitation is unfortunately also increasing with climate change. These are just a few examples of why women and girls are more vulnerable as a result of climate change.
Thank you so much for that. It really shows that all of these things are very much so interconnected, and that's why having conversations like these are so important so that we can draw those connections. And I know you touched on this a little bit, but our next question is, which inequities are particularly amplified by climate change?
Well, I can help on this one. I think there are tons. And gender inequality is a big one, and also economic inequality and poverty is another one. So in recent decades, global economic growth has lifted millions of people out of extreme poverty and reduced inequalities between countries. But unmanaged climate change is threatening such progress by damaging poverty eradication efforts worldwide and disproportionately affecting the poorest regions and people. So according to a World Bank report, there is an estimation that 68 to 135 million people could be pushed into poverty by 2030. And that is because of climate change. And the research shows that there is a big chance that climate change would reverse the gains of the past few decades and cause inequality between countries to rise again. which leads indirectly or directly to the rise of gender inequality as well. So as mentioned before, 70% of the word poor are women. And in my opinion, it is important to encourage for gender equality worldwide. So countries with higher levels of gender equality tend to have higher income levels and evidence for a number of regions and countries that shows that closing the gap leads to a reduction of poverty. An example of that is in Latin America, according to an Oxfam study, an increase in the number of women in paid work between 2000 and 2010 accounted for around 30% of the overall reduction in poverty and income inequality. So I do believe that supporting women to have access to quality and decent work and improve their livelihoods is something that is crucial to fulfill women's rights and reduce poverty.
Thank you so much for that. Those statistics are honestly mind-blowing, and sometimes hearing those things out loud really make you stop in your tracks. So we're going to transition a little bit into the cause and effect section. The influence of the climate crisis is felt disproportionately in various spheres in the lives of women and girls, including their safety, health and nutrition, access to education, and their very livelihoods, as we've gone over. So what is the impact of climate change on access to educational opportunities for women and girls?
Well, evidence suggests that climate change can impact the education sector directly through effects related to the damage of education infrastructure, loss of education materials, injury or mortality of students, teachers, and parents, and stress resulting from the exposure to extreme weather events. So speaking on how climate change is affecting girls and women education specifically, so girls in vulnerable households are more likely to drop out and get married during a weather crisis to be able to help their families. And according to a study that is made by the Malala Fund organization, in 2011, a severe drought hit East Africa due to an abnormally late rainfalls and poor harvest. So that affected over 11.5 million people into one of the worst food security crises that the region has ever experienced. And as a result, more families married off their daughters in exchange of livestock. And around the world, girls are the first to leave school during climate crisis in order to help ease the burden of the household resources. Like many weather-related disasters, droughts will happen more frequently as global temperature increase and impact the Earth's water cycle. So something should definitely be done. I do have another example on how climate change is also affecting girls' education. And that is climate change closes schools and displaces students in some situations. But did you know that 4 out of 5 people displaced by climate change are females? And girls are often to be less likely to re-enroll in school than boys following a climate-related event. So in 2010, heavy floods occurred in Pakistan that destroyed 11,000 schools there. Once schools are reopened, fewer girls were re-enrolled than boys. And similar thing happened in Somalia. So families migrated from rural to urban areas as a result of floodings, droughts, and conflicts. And girls enrolled, the enrollment rates of girls dropped from 45% to 29%. In contrast, from boys' enrollment rate, it roses after that following displacement from 29% to 41%, according to another study by the Malala Fund organization. So without urgent action, climate change will make it very difficult to achieve a quality education, especially for disadvantaged girls and young women.
Wow, those numbers are like unfortunate, especially with a 4 out of 5 girls. Was it not enrolling back, or not being enrolled in school. What was it?
So it is 4 out of every 5 people displaced by climate change are actually female.
Girls.
Yeah.
It's insane. It's unfortunate.
It's so sad, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we'll move on to the next question, which is, what impact does climate change have on Canadian society as a whole and the world at large?
So I can start for that question. So climate change is a huge and important issue that we should monitor and act to improve. Worldwide, due to climate change, there are more frequent and intense droughts, storms, heat waves, and rising sea levels. All these issues can directly harm animals, destroy the places that we live in, impact people's livelihoods and communities in a negative way. And as climate change worsens, dangerous weather events are becoming more and more frequent and severe. So if we're speaking specifically in Canada, Atlantic Canada is one of the regions in Canada that is most threatened by climate change. And it is predicted that this region will experience more storm events, increase its storm intensity, the rise of sea levels, and even flooding due to the global warmer temperatures. And experts also predict that climate change will contribute to the increase of the forest fires in Canada due to the worsening of 3 major factors that are hot conditions, frequency of lightning strikes, and high winds. So the situation is really bad, both internationally and within Canada.
Yes, and to echo off of Rodayna, climate change knows no borders and affects any geographical location. Canada is not an exception, and it's time to talk about how climate change is affecting the people of the North. Like I mentioned, I took a course this past semester called the Arctic Environment. And in my general definition, the Inuit people have been affected by climate change and global warming, which increases food vulnerability and food insecurity. To put it simply, climate change is exacerbating food insecurity in Inuit communities of the Canadian Arctic. For example, in the Canadian territory of Nunavut, over 50% of Inuit populations are estimated to be in a state of food vulnerability, which has been a multifaceted effect of climate change. Contributing factors include residing in geographically remote regions and having a lifestyle rooted in tradition. There are 2 main routes of obtaining food in the Canadian Arctic: subsistence hunting or purchasing food from grocery stores. Although Inuit people in the 21st century may not be fully dependent on subsistence hunting compared to those in, pre-industrial times, the Inuit who still practice traditional ways of living heavily rely on hunting to nourish themselves. Subsistence hunting yields difficulties for human health because the cold temperate regions in the Arctic act as sinks for persistent organic pollutants. POPs contribute to the reduction of minimal ecological niches and habitat diversity and human health implications because humans are eating these animals that have a whole load of contaminants in them. In contrast, relying on the current system of importing groceries from Southern Canada is not financially or environmentally sustainable, and it's not a solution when considering the inflation and rising costs of transportation. While the Western system of food does increase accessibility to food and nourishment, it is facilitated by sea shipping or flying goods and materials from the South. Again, it's not fiscally or environmentally sustainable, and it's so costly to ship and fly in these products from the South. Consumers see these costs reflected in the high prices on commercial shelves and thus become a struggle to buying these foods from grocery stores because of the inconsistent shipments and the inflation of prices. Other than culture, this is an influencing reason as to why Inuit people choose to eat country foods, which consist of a diverse variety of non-domesticated wildlife like game meats, fish, and migratory birds. As a result, habitat loss, reduced species populations, and increased contaminant concentrations are byproducts of climate change targeting the most vulnerable Canadian region in terms of food insecurity, the Inuit people of the Arctic tundra. The traditional lifestyle of Inuit subsistence hunting has become vulnerable due to factors including the degradation of habitat diversity, melting glaciers, and the bioaccumulation and biomagnification of toxic chemicals. The direct correlation between sea ice loss, due to global warming, and ecological shifts negatively influences Arctic species populations by affecting keystone and culturally important Arctic organisms. Keystone species are species of animals that are super important within the food chain. And many keystone species that are important to the ecology and environment are also culturally important to the Inuit people because that's what they consume most of the time. The results of habitat quality declines have caused population declines in species, such as the abundance of ring seals and polar bears. So polar bears, ring seals are the main prey of polar bears, and Inuit people eat polar bears, which directly threatens the security of traditional food sourcing methods for Inuit people. Though the current Western system of imported Southern goods increases food accessibility, again, it monopolizes the geographical and isolation of the Arctic. This is reflected in cost inflation, inconsistent supply chains, and the increased costs and carbon emissions of transportation. Thus, the multi-pronged effects of climate change pose a significant risk to the security of Inuit food systems through traditional and Western food sourcing means. And this is all happening in our Canadian backyard. That was my answer for that question.
It was a great answer. And just that last line, all of this is happening right in our backyard. And a lot of the times, a lot of us are very unaware of it. I will speak for myself. I was very unaware of it. And I think that just being able to educate ourselves about these issues and how they affect our local communities, our national communities, our international communities is so, so important, because until we know about it, we cannot make a change about it. So that leads us to our final section of the podcast, which is focused on youth advocacy and empowerment. The ongoing climate crisis introduces a new challenge, which is adopting ecological policies that do not detract from, but rather reinforce human rights initiatives. We must engage transdisciplinary perspectives to develop a framework for tangible applications of these principles in light of the constantly changing environmental conditions. So, along this note, our next question is, what does climate empowerment mean and look like to you?
Well, I can start. So climate empowerment is the personal and political process of claiming and using your knowledge, power, and rights to address the root causes of climate change. So this includes ending and changing systems that are unfair and accessing resources and opportunities to take action against climate change and its effects. And climate change or climate empowerment term, it is actually adapted from the ACE or the ACE or the Action for Climate Empowerment, which is a term created by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the purpose of that was to demote the work under Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, and which has 6 main components of action for climate empowerment. And those components are education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation on these issues. So the implementation of all 6 areas has been identified as the pivotal factor for everyone to understand and participate in solving the complex challenges presented by climate change. And the importance of the ACE or ACE, or the Action for Climate Empowerment, however you say it, is reflected in other international frameworks as well, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's climate empowerment in a nutshell for me.
Yes, Rodayna, thank you so much for your answer. And I'll just take this moment to and I'll just take this moment to respond on what climate empowerment means and looks like to me. So with any social justice topic and movement, I believe true change comes from the inherent empowerment of oneself and others. Climate empowerment to me means continuously advocating my call to action and using opportunities to create conversations about climate action. The more climate action is at the forefront of our minds, the more likely we are as a collective to problem solve ways to conserve, remediate, and help the environment, and thus help others. If there are no opportunities, then I will find ways to create my own opportunities for myself, but also others, opening up and continuing the dialogue. Educating oneself on these important topics are key to becoming a better global citizen and advocate, and honestly, just generally being a better person. I am grateful and I recognize my privilege pursuing a Bachelor of Science. So I have had lectures during my post-secondary education career on climate change and its effects, such as my Arctic environment course. I do understand how it may be difficult to take the initiative to do your own research because it is so easy to get overwhelmed with the abundance of materials and oftentimes get deflated and lose your inspiration and motivation. But even reading a post on Instagram counts as research. The more you engage in the material, the more knowledgeable you become. So once you read that Instagram post, like it, share it, comment, and then maybe go into Google and search up something from that post. Does it check out? Does the Instagram post exaggerate? How accurate are the facts? Taking these steps to verify our source of information is also a good way to maintain an open mind when dealing with critical topics. But of course, it's so easy to get burnt out when you are constantly going through these cycles of feeling like the most empowered person in the world to feeling dejected after realizing that perhaps the Instagram post you saw actually contradicts the most updated scientific research. This is why I think perseverance plays a major role in activism. Speaking on my experiences as a Plant International Canada National Youth Advocate for one of their recent campaigns called the Change the Birth Story campaign, which brought awareness to Canadians on maternal, newborn, child health, and sexual reproductive health rights. Part of my role in this was to engage as many Canadians as I could about these topics. I had to ensure that they were able to get some major key takeaways from my platform and my call to action and voice, because I verified their understanding via endorsements. Now, an endorsement could be a photo, of course, with the person's permission, or a signature on paper, like an actual handwritten signature. And this was, of course, all pre-COVID. At first, I had so much energy and inspiration and this drive to reach hundreds of Canadians. I had a couple of hundred students in my high school. It wasn't the biggest high school, but I did have, some friends of friends and friends. And high school, we're also interconnected. So I thought it'd be super easy to reach my goal. I created and facilitated my own conferences to help raise public awareness and youth engagement with these issues. But as I transitioned from these conversations from discussing with my friends and youth to older folks, something happened in that shift of narrative. It was so hard, I found, to stop strangers and bring up these topics of maternal, newborn, child health and sexual reproductive health and rights. I remember going between rows of my sister's high school graduation during intermission and going up to parents of students who are graduating and continuing this dialogue. It was such an awkward experience, and many times I felt a little embarrassed and like an imposter. Like, what am I doing here in my sister's graduation when it should be like such a keystone moment in families' lives that their child is graduating, and here am I bringing up these topics. But on the flip side, the dialogue always has to be continued no matter the situation. It was harder to continue the conversation and even harder to bring them into dialogue. Eventually, I did receive over 600 endorsements, but honestly, it's not the number that sticks with me at the end of the day. It's the conversations and the experiences that we shared. It honestly sounds so cheesy, and I'm literally saying this with a smile on my face, but climate empowerment is activism, and during your advocacy journey, you must never give up. You will come across what seems like an infinite amount of obstacles, challenges, and a huge lack of engagement from youth and other folks. But just inviting that one person into the conversation and empowering them, that allows them to continue what you started.
Thank you so much. That's so, like, when you were talking about your sister's graduation, I was like, yeah, it is a time to celebrate, but at the same time, you're right. The conversation doesn't just stop out of nowhere. It has to continue everywhere you go. So thank you for that. Okay, so our next question is, what role do governments and organizations, businesses, and educational institutions have in addressing climate change?
So yeah, I can speak to that question. So let me speak to some of Plan International Canada's work. So Plan International Canada supports youth to grow awareness of their rights and put themselves at the forefront as agents of sustainable development. And Plan International Canada engage with communities, especially youth as they become leaders in climate change solutions through a variety of themes. And those themes are agriculture, greening the economy, fighting child early marriage, and forced child marriage as well.
Awesome. Could you possibly touch on the first one, like the agriculture?
Yes.
Can you
yes.
expand on that so we can understand?
Yeah, of course. That is actually a great question. So Plan International Canada works with young people and their families to develop solar irrigation alternatives and climate smart agriculture solutions. And in addition to being more sustainable and increasing their productions, these solutions help farmers manage the impacts of increased drought or unpredictable rains on their crops. So Plan International Canada worked with local farmers to develop production systems targeted to best respond to the impacts of climate change in their environment, while equipping them to adjust these systems to suit changing conditions over time. Another thing that Plan International Canada does is improving farmers' access to weather and planting information right from their phones. So they can make the best farming decisions for their crops. And to further support these agricultural changes, there are villages and savings and loans and associations that are formed in many communities where Plan International Canada work, providing a tool for communities to collectively support each other and adapt through the financial shocks and stresses that climate change can actually cause.
That's awesome. Thank you. Did you want to touch on also the other 2 points as well?
I can touch quickly on the fighting the child early and forced marriage. So climate change can lead to shortages in agriculture productions and increases the frequency of intensity of storms, causing or leading to disasters, making it difficult for the most vulnerable to recover from the financial hardships caused by climate change. And for families living in poverty, child marriage is often seen as a way to ensure their daughters will be taken care of and provided for. So Plan International Canada is working in these disasters areas to support sustainable businesses and fight child marriage. And that is through sustainable enterprises such as the aquaculture or mangrove planting. So young people, particularly girls and young women, are increasing their economic opportunities and at the same time provides an alternative to child marriage for them. So this programming builds up communities to withstand disasters while empowering girls to make informed decisions that affect their lives. So this is just a little bit about what is Plan Canada's work on climate change.
For sure. And just to echo off of Rodayna, our modern world is so interconnected and we need policies created, but also implemented that target climate action. It's so great to continue the dialogue, but without actual implementation of these policies, it will be hard to achieve and propel the climate action movement. Organizations and businesses similarly must also adopt a more sustainable focus, and learning about the environment in regards to climate change and climate action must be implemented into secondary education curriculum. Honestly, growing up, and just reflecting on my own secondary education, other than learning how to recycle, what goes in the blue bin, what goes in the black or green bin, that was the extent of my environmental knowledge. And honestly, even now, studying biology at university, without having to take the initiative of taking electives that have course names with the Arctic environment or climate change, these topics honestly are not discussed that much in relation to people as it is to wildlife. And while wildlife is so interconnected with humans, it's time that we continue the discussion.
Thank you so much for that. This is why I love Plan, because they are continually doing the work on the ground, going into communities and making sure that all these needs are addressed. And then more on an individual level, how can students help to address this issue within their local communities?
I love this question. I think students, young professionals, and anyone listening to us today can actually address climate change by various actions. It can be by going green, and that is by using carpool or reusable straws or water bottles, or growing their own veggies or donating their clothes. So these examples may seem that they are small actions, but it's definitely a great start. They can even use their online platforms to share awareness about what they have learned from today's podcast and tag us at Plan International Canada and also UTM Champion of Change, if you folks are okay with that. So that can definitely be another action that they can take.
That's a wonderful idea for sure. So if you folks, for the viewers, want to tag Plan International Canada Champions of Change UTM in any sustainable or green actions that you're taking to help combat climate change, that would be great. Thank you.
So in this question is just something I just spent more talking about. As a student, I am always on a budget, and many will come to realize that saving the planet also saves your wallet. Transitioning into a more zero waste lifestyle can be a luxury, which I totally understand, but it's also very affordable in the long term and more accessible than you may think. One of the easiest transitions that you may not even think of is unplugging any electronic chargers and appliances. Seriously, unplug your phone charger from your wall right now if it's not being used. Turning off lights is super helpful and also decreases your electricity bill as well. Walking, carpooling, or getting a public bus or subway pass is amazing and greatly reduces your carbon footprint. It's so important to stay hydrated, so ditch that plastic water bottle and opt for a cute reusable water bottle and that you can fill up in between classes. Donating and selling your clothes on platforms like Instagram reduces the amount of clothes that would otherwise go to a landfill. Let your clothes have a second life and be loved again. All of these small things, like bring your own bag when shopping, like reusable bag, recycling correctly, and basing purchases off of needs versus wants, these will all definitely make you a sustainable superstar. You can even take your climate empowerment further by, again, moving into the world of social media. As Gen Z, I'm pretty sure I can speak for this entire generation by saying that we are most likely checking our phones a couple million times throughout the day. So sharing posts is a great way to start your activism, but you also have to remember that it's just a start. It's amazing and incredible that you're taking the first step to continue your education of certain social justice topics and educating others, but remember to take your actions further and beyond your phone and the walls of social media. At the end of the day, performative activism can do more harm than it does good. So really try to incorporate and adopt a few of these suggestions into your daily lives. And then I'll pass the mic back to Rodayna.
Yeah, no, this is amazing. I love those suggestions, Charlotte. I think they're very important and they're very practical and can relate to many of us. Another two ideas actually that I do have is that for folks to take action is to learn more and spread the word. So there is a toolkit that was created by myself, my colleagues, and the Youth Advisory Council support in Plan International Canada. And Charlotte is actually one of the members that supported in feeding into that toolkit while it was developing. So this toolkit has a lot of information about climate change and how to become a youth advocate. So I can send you folks the link and you can share it with folks who are interested in having such resource. But Charlotte, if you'd like to speak a little bit about your experience with developing that toolkit, feel free to.
Yeah, for sure. So I had the amazing opportunity to provide feedback in the development of a climate change toolkit created by the fabulous Rodayna and Plan colleagues since I serve on Plan International Canada's Youth Council. It was such a cool and once-in-a-lifetime experience to be able to provide insight and ideas into something tangible that folks of all ages and whatever part they're on in their activism journey, they can use to benefit from. Honestly, don't tell the manager of the youth council, but I literally wrote my feedback at like 12 a.m. the day it was due. Like, it was crazy. I really took advantage of the time change of EST to ADT I really took advantage of that because while it was honestly mandatory, because for us to, for youth council members to provide insight on, I didn't realize the benefits that I would have received from providing feedback on it. I felt like a true editor in like a publishing firm in New York City, just looking through the document and focusing on each small detail from graphic designs to wording that allowed the document to be accessible to all ages, since plan does target youth opportunities for ages 14 to 24. I remember just being like thinking back to my childhood days when I would go to restaurants like Boston Pizza and we would be given a kids menu and they would have tiny activities while we wait for our food to be ordered. And the toolkit has a similar like exercise and activity where you sort of match up definitions. And I just remembered from my times doing childhood activities and crossword puzzles that I would actually put more effort in if I didn't know the answer. So I suggested, like, for example, putting the answer to a definition like upside down and on the bottom. So the youth reading and doing the toolkit actually put in effort versus just the answer just being there in plain sight. So it was such a cool opportunity and I'm so grateful to have had it and then seeing the finished product. It was such like a shock me moment, and it was released in time for the 66th Commission of the Status of Women. So I really hope folks all across the world took advantage of this amazing resource that I helped be a part of. And before I pass it on to Rodayna, I just wanted to leave you folks with something that really has stuck with me ever since I heard it. Shout out to my part-time job and mandatory training video that I barely paid attention to until I heard this. Honestly, guys, if you take something away, it's this. Like, sometimes the mandatory things just really have the best values and takeaways. So I heard this in a mandatory training video that I had to do for my part-time job, and it is local actions make global impacts. What may seem small and indifferent to you, if you continue to practice sustainable options in your life and continue climate empowerment of yourself, but also others, you are creating concrete change that will affect global, tangible change. So I'll just leave you with that to ponder, and I'll pass it back to Rodayna.
Wow.
This is super inspiring. I love it.
I know, like, who would have thought in like a part-time corporate job selling shoes, they'd have such inspiring words.
No,
Oh my God, it really sticks with you.
This is great. Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to say that, like, those are all some ideas, and I'm so sure that listeners to that podcast will probably have more and more ideas and innovations. So the important thing is just to take an action.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for that. I will say I did go through the toolkit. It is really helpful. I love the little matching activity. So I would highly recommend to our listeners, our viewers, if you do get the chance, we will link it in our description. So check it out. Thank you so much for all your amazing words. We've learned so much. That was a great discussion. It really emphasizes the fact that having simple conversations with the people around you can really shift your mindset. And that's why we're so happy that we have the opportunity to produce Speak as an outlet for this.
Once again, we would like to extend a huge thank you to both Charlotte and Rodayna for generously giving us their time and energy and offering their expertise to us. We've learned so much today, as Esty mentioned, and the lessons that we've learned today, we will be taking it forward with us, and we hope for the viewers to do the same. If you folks have anything else, any closing remarks to mention?
For me, I just want to say thank you so much, Esty and Mara, and for having me and Charlotte today with you folks. You folks are stars. I loved having the conversation with you too. Thank you for taking an action by sharing great awareness throughout your podcast. And I would encourage our listeners to share their learnings from today with family, friends, and on social media. You never know who you could impact by just sharing the word. So again, thank you so much. And it was a pleasure being here.
Yeah, and just similarly, thank you so much to Esty and Mara and Champions of Change UTM for allowing me and Rodayna to be here today. All the work that you folks continue to do is so inspiring, and I can't wait to be caught up and updated with all the work you will continue to do. And again, thank you so much to the listeners and viewers of the Speak podcast. I had so much fun, and I hope you learned something today that sparks that fire in you to create change.
Thank you for listening to Speak. Visit www.championsofchangeutn.com and follow all of our social media pages to keep up to date with our upcoming initiatives and to learn how you can be the change your community needs to see. Until next time, remember to use your voice.